A woman stands before a mirror, practicing her smile for the third time this morning. Behind her, her lover sleeps, unaware that she's been rehearsing this face since dawn. Sarah's morning ritual began like any other: coffee, shower, the careful application of foundation over the dark circles that told the truth her words never would. But today felt different. Today, Marcus would finally see her without the mask she'd worn for 8 months. Or so she believed. The truth was, Sarah had never shown anyone her real face, not even herself. The world tilted as she stepped through her bathroom door and found herself not in her bedroom, but in a vast museum with marble floors that reflected nothing. The walls stretched impossibly high, lined with glass cases containing what looked like frozen moments: a first kiss suspended in amber, a wedding dance trapped in crystal, a child's laughter preserved like a butterfly pinned to velvet. Each display case bore a small bronze plaque: "Perfect Love," donated by S. Mitchell; "Eternal Happiness," donated by S. Mitchell; "The Feeling of Being Enough," donated by S. Mitchell. The air tasted of old roses and unfulfilled promises. Sarah walked between the exhibits, her bare feet silent on the cold stone, until she reached the center of the museum, where a single empty pedestal waited. Beside it stood a figure in a dark coat, neither man nor woman, ageless and knowing. The curator. "Magnificent collection," the curator said, voice like wind through autumn leaves. "You've been building this for years. Each moment you thought love should feel like, each fantasy of how he should look at you, each script of what he should say, all perfectly preserved." Sarah's chest tightened. "These aren't fantasies. These are hopes." "Are they?" The curator gestured to a case containing what appeared to be Marcus, frozen mid-gesture, reaching for her with an expression of pure adoration she had never actually seen on his face. This version of him, does he exist outside these walls? The museum began to shift and breathe around them. The exhibits grew larger, more elaborate, until they towered over the Sarah like monuments to her own impossible standards. In one case, Marcus was proposing with tears in his eyes, speaking words he had never said. In another, he was fighting for her, defending her against critics who existed only in her mind. Each display was perfect, crystalline, and utterly lifeless. "Schopenhauer warned us," the curator whispered, moving closer, "that love is the will to live playing its cruelest trick, making us believe another person can complete the incomplete self. But you, Sarah, you've gone further. You've fallen in love not with Marcus, but with your museum of him." The empty pedestal began to glow with a soft, hungry light. Sarah understood with horrible clarity what it was waiting for: the real Marcus, the one who forgot to text back, who left dishes in the sink, who loved her imperfectly because he was human. The real Marcus, who could never compete with the impossible exhibits she had created. "The choice is yours," the curator said. "Keep building your museum, collecting perfect moments that will never breathe, or..." The curator gestured toward a small, unremarkable door Sarah hadn't noticed before. Through its window, she could see her real bedroom, where the real Marcus was waking up, hair messy, reaching for her side of the bed with sleepy confusion. Sarah's hand trembled as she reached for the door handle. Behind her, the museum held its breath. Every perfect moment she had ever imagined, waiting to see if she would choose the warmth of reality over the cold perfection of her dreams. The ancients called it a curse. Today, psychology names it the idealization-devaluation cycle, a pattern where we create impossible standards for love, then punish reality for failing to meet our fantasies. Coined by object relation theorists, this cycle manifests everywhere. In relationships where we exhaust partners trying to make them match our internal scripts. In social media where we curate perfect moments while real life crumbles. In careers where we chase phantom versions of success that leave us emptier with each achievement. Schopenhauer would call this a subtle trick of the will, the blind life force that drives us toward endless wanting. The will makes us believe that if we could just find or create the perfect love, the perfect moment, the perfect person, our suffering would end. But perfection is the enemy of presence, and the museum of ideal moments becomes a prison where nothing real can ever enter. What does your museum look like? What perfect moments have you been collecting while life passes by outside? The door is always there, waiting. But first, you must be willing to let your exhibits crumble into the beautiful, imperfect dust of what is actually possible. Some doors only open when we stop trying to carry our museums through them. A man sits alone in his apartment, scrolling through photos of his ex-girlfriend with her new partner. He tells himself he's just checking to see if she's happy, but his thumb hovers over each image like a tongue probing a wound. David had perfected the art of noble suffering. For 3 months since Elena left, he had worn his heartbreak like a badge of honor, speaking of her in hushed, reverent tones to friends who had long since grown tired of his romantic martyrdom. But tonight, something shifted in the familiar ritual of his pain. The apartment began to stretch and warp, walls dissolving into rich burgundy curtains. David found himself seated not on his couch, but in a plush velvet chair in an ornate theater. The stage before him was bathed in golden light, and there, performing a magnificent soliloquy about lost love, was himself, or rather, a more dramatic version of himself, wearing a flowing cape and gesturing grandly to an audience of shadows. "Behold," the stage David declared, "a man destroyed by love's cruel hand. See how I suffer with such grace, such depth. Is there anyone who has loved as purely, lost as completely?" The audience of shadows applauded with hollow enthusiasm. In the front row sat Elena, but not as she really was. This Elena wore a black dress and wept constantly, consumed by regret for leaving such a magnificent sufferer. Beside her sat the new boyfriend, but in this theater he was weak, shallow, clearly unworthy of Elena's true depth. David tried to leave his seat, to call out that this wasn't real, but found himself trapped in the chair as if by invisible bonds. A figure emerged from the wings, the theater director, tall and gaunt, with eyes like old stage lights. "Magnificent performance," the director said, settling into the seat beside David. "You've been rehearsing this role for months. The tragic hero, the man who loved too deeply, the victim of shallow times. It's quite convincing." On stage, the performance continued. Stage David was now detailing Elena's flaws with poetic cruelty, explaining to the shadow audience how she couldn't appreciate true love, how she was too damaged by past relationships to recognize his devotion. The shadows nodded sympathetically. "But here's the beautiful trick," the director whispered. "As long as you're the star of this tragedy, you never have to examine if she actually left. Never have to face the controlling texts, the way you made her feel small for wanting space, the passive aggression disguised as sensitivity." The theater began to spin slowly, and David saw other stages where Elena was the villain, where his mother was the witch who never loved him enough, where every ex-girlfriend was either a saint who got away or a demon who wounded him. In each performance, David was the noble sufferer, the misunderstood artist of emotion. Schopenhauer understood, the director continued, that we cling to suffering because it gives the ego something to be. Your pain has become your identity. Without it, who would you be? Just another person learning to love without the drama of grand tragedy. The shadow audience was growing restless. Some were leaving their seats, bored by the endless repetition of David's magnificent suffering. Even the fake Elena was checking her phone. "The choice is yours," the director said, gesturing to a simple exit sign glowing in the darkness. "Keep performing your pain, or step off the stage and discover who you might be without an audience for your suffering." David looked at the exit, then back at the stage where his dramatic double was building to another crescendo of beautiful agony. The spotlight was so warm, the audience's attention so intoxicating, even when they were only shadows of his own making. But in the back of the theater, barely visible, sat a small figure he almost didn't recognize. The real Elena, not weeping, not regretting, just tired and relieved to be free from a love that had demanded she play audience to someone else's eternal performance. In myth, it was a ghost. In you, it's the habit you can't see, victim mentality, first identified by transactional analysis in the 1960s. This psychological pattern manifests in relationships where we assign ourselves the permanent role of the wounded party. In workplaces where we collect grievances like trophies. In families where we become the designated sufferer whose pain gives them purpose. The victim mentality thrives on an audience, whether real or imagined. Schopenhauer would call this the will's most clever disguise, making us believe that suffering itself is noble, that pain is proof of depth. The will keeps us addicted to the drama of our wounds because as long as we're performing our pain, we never have to do the harder work of healing it. The ego feeds on being special, even if that specialness comes from being specially wronged. What role have you been rehearsing? What audience do you perform your wounds for? The stage lights are seductive, but the exit is always there, leading to the quiet work of becoming someone who doesn't need an audience for their healing. The most revolutionary act is sometimes the refusal to be interesting in your suffering. A woman stands in her kitchen, arranging flowers in a vase with mathematical precision. Each stem must be exactly 3 inches apart, each bloom facing the same direction. If anyone asks, she'll say she just likes things neat, but her hands shake until the last petal falls into place. Margaret had built her life like a Swiss watch, every routine calibrated, every possibility controlled, every spontaneous moment scheduled and contained. She called it being organized. But at 3 a.m., when she couldn't sleep until she'd checked the locks for the 5th time, she knew it was something else entirely. The kitchen began to shift around her, walls stretching upward into an impossible architectural space. Margaret found herself standing in a vast workshop filled with blueprints, measuring tools, and half-finished structures that defied physics. At the center of it all stood a magnificent building, her life, she realized, but it was covered in scaffolding, wrapped in chains, and surrounded by barriers that grew higher with each passing moment. "Impressive work," said a voice behind her. Margaret turned to find a figure in architect's clothing, but where a face should be, there was only a mirror reflecting her own anxious features. 37 years of construction, and still no one can get in or out. Margaret walked around her life building, admiring the craftsmanship despite herself. Every window was barred with elegant ironwork, labeled reasonable precautions. Every door was locked with multiple mechanisms marked necessary boundaries. The foundation was solid, reinforced with decades of worst-case scenarios and contingency plans. "I'm just careful," Margaret said, running her hands along a wall, inscribed with all the things that could go wrong if she wasn't vigilant. "I'm responsible. Are you?" The architect figure gestured to the building's peak, where Margaret could see a tiny figure of herself, alone in a tower room, surrounded by monitoring devices that showed every possible threat to her carefully constructed world. "Or have you become the prisoner of your own protection?" The workshop around them began to reveal its true nature. Every tool was double-edged, the measuring tape stretched into a leash, the blueprints became a labyrinth of rules she had to follow. The foundation stones were carved with the word control repeated like a mantra. She had spent decades building a fortress against uncertainty, and now she lived inside its walls, forgetting why she had built them in the first place. "Look closer," the architect said, pointing to the building's blueprint. The original design, faded but still visible beneath layers of additions, showed something completely different: a simple house with open doors, wide windows, a garden where anything could grow. But with each year, each disappointment, each small hurt, Margaret had added another wall, another lock, another reason why spontaneity was dangerous. Schopenhauer called it the prison of certainty, the architect whispered, voice echoing from the mirror face. "You think you're protecting yourself from suffering, but you've created a different kind of cage, one where nothing can hurt you because nothing can truly reach you." As Margaret watched, she saw other versions of herself throughout the years. The young woman who used to dance in rain, the girl who made friends easily, the teenager who fell in love without calculating the risks. Each had been carefully sealed away behind another wall, labeled growing up, or being realistic, or learning from mistakes. The architect handed Margaret a sledgehammer. "The choice is yours. Keep building higher walls against a world that might disappoint you. Or..." Margaret looked at the hammer, then at her magnificent fortress. Inside, she could see the tiny figure of herself, growing smaller and more isolated with each passing day, surrounded by all the safety she had ever wanted and none of the life she had forgotten she was protecting. A crack appeared in the foundation, not from external threat, but from the weight of carrying so much protection. Margaret realized with crystal clarity that she had become so afraid of being hurt that she had forgotten how to be fully alive. The ancients called it a curse. Today, psychology names it the anxiety control paradox, the phenomenon where our attempts to control uncertainty create the very suffering we're trying to avoid. First documented in cognitive behavioral research, this pattern manifests in helicopter parenting that prevents children from developing resilience, in relationship dynamics where overprotection kills intimacy, in careers where perfectionism creates paralysis instead of success. Schopenhauer would recognize this as the will's most subtle trap, convincing us that we can think our way out of life's fundamental uncertainty. But the will to control is just suffering in disguise, trading the sharp pain of occasional disappointment for the dull ache of perpetual anxiety. Control is the illusion that if we just plan enough, worry enough, protect enough, we can exempt ourselves from the human condition. What fortress have you built around your life? What are you protecting yourself from so carefully that you've forgotten what you're protecting? The sledgehammer feels heavy, but so does carrying a building on your shoulders for the rest of your life. Sometimes the bravest thing is not building another wall. A man scrolls through social media, studying the vacation photos, career updates, and philosophical musings of people he barely knows. He takes mental notes, filing away their confidence, their style, their apparent ease with life. By tomorrow, he'll be wearing their insights like clothes that don't quite fit. James had become a master of acquisition, though he never bought anything tangible. Instead, he collected personalities, harvesting them from conversations, movies, books, and the endless stream of curated lives online. He told himself he was learning, growing, becoming more sophisticated, but late at night, alone with his thoughts, he couldn't remember which ideas were originally his. The room began to shift, walls becoming mirrors that reflected not his face, but dozens of different versions of himself. James the intellectual, James the artist, James the spiritual seeker, James the successful entrepreneur. Each reflection wore a different costume, spoke with a different accent, carried different mannerisms borrowed from different people he had studied and absorbed. "Welcome to the collection," said a voice from everywhere and nowhere. A figure materialized from the mirrors, constantly shifting, never quite solid, wearing James's face, but with features that morphed and changed like water. "I am the curator of selves. You've been feeding me for years." James walked among the mirrors, watching his borrowed selves perform. Here was the version of him that quoted philosophy after reading a single article. There was the one that adopted the cynical wit of a podcast host he admired. And in the corner, the James who had spent weeks perfecting the casual confidence of a colleague who seemed to navigate the world with effortless grace. "Impressive range," the curator said, features settling momentarily into the face of James's therapist before shifting again. "You've become everyone and no one, a walking anthology of other people's personalities." The mirrors began to multiply, creating an infinite corridor of borrowed selves. James could see himself adopting the laugh of a friend, the political opinions of an influencer, the relationship advice of a self-help guru who had never been married. Each reflection was perfectly executed, but somehow hollow, like an actor playing a role they had never understood. "But here's the beautiful tragedy," the curator continued, now wearing the face of James's father, then his ex-girlfriend, then a stranger from a coffee shop. "In your quest to become everyone else, you've lost track of the one person you were born to be. Do you even remember him?" At the end of the mirror corridor, James glimpsed something that made his chest tighten. A small plain mirror that showed nothing but darkness, not because it was broken, but because there was no authentic self left to reflect. He had become so skilled at absorption, so talented at mimicry, that his original personality had been worn away like a stone polished smooth by endless water. "Schopenhauer understood," the curator whispered, face cycling through everyone James had ever tried to become, "that the will makes us hungry for identity, desperate to be something, anything, rather than face the terrifying possibility that maybe we're nothing special at all. So you feast on other people's authenticity, hoping some of it will stick." The mirrors began to crack, and through the fissures, James could see glimpses of moments when he had been genuinely himself. A child laughing at his own joke, a teenager writing in a journal with no audience, a young man having an original thought that he had dismissed as worthless. Each authentic moment was small, unremarkable, but real in a way that all his borrowed sophistication could never be. "The choice," the curator said, features finally settling into an empty frame, "is whether to keep collecting other people's depth or risk discovering that your own shallow end might be the only place where something real can grow." James reached toward the dark mirror at the corridor's end. His hand trembled, not from fear of what he might find, but from the terrifying possibility that he might find nothing at all. Or worse, that nothing at all might be exactly where he needed to start. In myth, it was a ghost. In you, it's the habit you can't see, false self syndrome. Developed by psychologist Donald Winnicott in the 1960s, this adaptive mechanism manifests in workplaces where we perform versions of ourselves we think will succeed, in relationships where we become what we believe others want, in social situations where we curate personalities from a mental database of approved characteristics. The false self is protection that becomes prison. Schopenhauer would recognize this as the will's desperate attempt to be anything rather than nothing, to matter in any way rather than risk being insignificant. But borrowed authenticity is like borrowed clothes. It never quite fits, and eventually everyone can tell it's not really yours. The false self feeds on external validation but starves the genuine person beneath. What version of yourself are you performing today? Which borrowed insights have you been wearing like costumes? The dark mirror is frightening, but it's also the only place where something genuinely yours can finally emerge. Authenticity isn't finding yourself. It's having the courage to stop hiding from what was always there. A woman sits in her therapist's office, describing her childhood with clinical precision. She has mapped every trauma, cataloged every dysfunction, built a perfect case for why she can't trust, can't love, can't risk. Her wounds have become her wisdom, her pain transformed into the very cage that keeps her safe from ever being hurt again. Rachel had spent 7 years in therapy, turning her past into a masterpiece of psychological understanding. She could explain her attachment style, trace her trust issues to their roots, articulate her triggers with academic precision. But as she spoke, she began to notice something strange. The office around her was changing. The familiar beige walls sprouted into living wood, and through the windows, instead of the city street, she could see a vast garden. But this was no ordinary garden. Every plant was wounded, flowers with broken stems carefully bandaged, trees with severed branches lovingly tended, bushes wrapped in protective wire to prevent any new growth that might risk damage. "Remarkable cultivation," said a voice behind her. Rachel turned to find her therapist transformed, no longer human, but a gardener made of intertwined roots and thorns, carrying pruning shears that gleamed with overuse. 7 years of careful tending, and not a single plant dares to bloom. And Rachel stood and walked into the garden, recognizing each wounded plant as a part of herself she had identified, analyzed, and carefully contained. Here was the rose bush of her mother issues, constantly pruned to prevent the risk of expecting too much from anyone. There was the oak of her romantic hopes, so carefully cut back after each relationship that only a stub remained, safe from future storms, but incapable of providing shade. "I'm healing," Rachel protested, touching the bandages on a lily that represented her capacity for joy. "I'm working on myself." "Are you?" The gardener moved among the plants with practiced efficiency, adjusting a splint here, tightening a protective covering there. "Or have you created a sanctuary for your wounds, a place where they can live forever without the risk of healing?" As Rachel explored further, she discovered the garden's terrible secret. Every plant had been kept in a state of permanent injury, not to heal them, but to protect them from ever being hurt again. The garden was perfect in its dysfunction, a museum of trauma where every wound was preserved, cataloged, and cherished as proof of survival. "Look closer," the gardener said, pointing to signs posted throughout the garden. "Fragile, handle with care, damaged by past experiences, do not expect normal growth. Approach with caution, victim of childhood trauma." Each plant wore its wounds like badges of honor, and Rachel realized she had been doing the same. At the garden's center stood the most protected plant of all, a small, ordinary flower completely encased in glass, surrounded by warning signs. The placard read, "Rachel's authentic self, severely damaged, do not disturb." Inside the case, the flower was perfectly preserved, but completely unable to grow, breathe, or touch the world around it. Schopenhauer warned us, the gardener whispered, shears clicking rhythmically, that suffering becomes addictive when it provides identity. You've turned your wounds into a philosophy, your pain into a personality. But healing isn't about understanding your damage. It's about risking new wounds in service of something greater. Through the garden's fence, Rachel could see a wild meadow where untended plants grew chaotically, some thriving, others dying, all of them fully alive and vulnerable to whatever weather came their way. No protective bandages, no warning signs, just the messy, dangerous business of growing toward the light. The choice, the gardener said, offering Rachel the key to the glass case, is whether to keep your wounds as pets or risk discovering who you might become if you stop protecting yourself from life. Rachel's hand shook as she reached for the key. Inside the case, the flower stirred slightly, as if it could sense the possibility of air, of sun, of the risk and reward of unprotected blooming. But the case was so safe, the garden so perfectly controlled, and the wild meadow so terrifyingly uncertain. The ancients called it a curse. Today, psychology names it trauma bonding with our own wounds, the phenomenon where we become so identified with our psychological injuries that healing feels like losing ourselves. First documented in therapeutic literature, this pattern manifests in support groups that become permanent identities, in relationships where we bond over shared damage rather than shared growth, in personal development that becomes endless self-excavation without transformation. Schopenhauer would call this the will's most sophisticated trap, making us believe that understanding our suffering is the same as transcending it. The will keeps us fascinated by our own psychological archaeology, digging endlessly in the ruins of the past, while the present moment waits for us to finally plant something new. Analysis without action becomes another form of avoidance. What wounds have you been tending instead of healing? What protective glass cases have you built around the parts of yourself that might bloom if you let them risk the weather? The key is in your hand, but the meadow doesn't come with guarantees. Only the promise that whatever grows there will be genuinely yours. Sometimes the deepest healing happens not in understanding why we're broken, but in discovering what we might build with the pieces.